Several years ago, I decided to write a book on Dr. Martin Luther King. And in the fact that this is Black History Month, I decided that I would share this story. In thinking that you're going to write a book and actually writing a book are two different things, I discovered that researching a book was about 80% of actually writing a book. But this was in 1990, so it was before the internet. And back then you had to actually go to the library, or you had to pick up the phone and call people, or do personal interviews. And so in order to do a book on the theology of Dr. King, I had to go either to the King Center in Atlanta, Georgia, or I could go to Boston College, which is of course in Boston, and read his papers that were there, his PhD work. And so I began to call the King Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And at first I didn't get anywhere. In fact, I was disgusted by trying to get to somebody that had actually spent time in the moment with Dr. King. And that was very, very difficult, because at each stage, the closer that you would get, each one of these people would want an honoraria for actually sitting down and doing an interview. And finally one day, this lady said to me, she said, "I know just who you need to talk to." She said, his name is Junius Griffin, and he is a professor at Michigan State University. And at the time, I lived in Grand Rapids. And she said, "It's not very far from you." And she said, "I know Dr. Griffin would be glad to do a sit-down interview with you." And she gave me his number, and I immediately called him. And he answered his own phone, and he said, "Dr. Griffin here, what's up?" And I said, "Dr. Griffin, this is Ken Dupin, and I'm writing a book on the theology of Dr. Martin Luther King." And I said, "I would like to know if you would set for an interview and talk about your relationship with Dr. King and share his views on really his systematic theology of Scripture." He thought for a moment, and he said, "I would love to do that." And he said, "I don't think I've ever been asked that question." But he said, "I would love to do that." And so we established a time, and I went to the university there at Lansing. And when I got there, of course, there was no place to park. And I remember from college days, bad parking was just short of like a felony. I mean, it was like, you just didn't do that. I finally found a visitor's lot, and I made my way to the English department. And when I was inside, I asked for where was Dr. Griffin's office, and somebody took me there and took me in the door and introduced me to his secretary. And then she announced me. And he said, "Oh man, come in. And here was this man of color, and he had this way about him that was just this Southern gentleman, but there was still this sophistication about him, with a scholar with a PhD in English. And I loved it. I just loved this guy. And so he said, "Come on in, sit down." And we began to chat and do some small talk. And then he said, "How did you come up with the idea of theology for Dr. King?" And I said, "Well, I had purchased a CD with all of his speeches, and I had read several of his books. But I said, I still never got a handle on what his theology was." And he said, "Well, I can help you there." He said, "I can share at least part of that." But I interrupted him, and I said, "But first," I said, "tell me about you." And he kind of smiled, and he said, "Well," he said, "I'm an interesting study," but he said, "I'm from Wise, Virginia. And I can tell you, anybody watching this has never been to Wise, through Wise, about Wise. It's not a place that you go to. It's down in the southwest corner of Virginia, where Tennessee and Kentucky all kind of come together. It's where the mountains and the valleys sort of connect up this sprawling valley followed by mountain range. And they have something colloquially there that they call back holler and front holler. And I never heard that term, but if you go on TikTok, there's probably 20 country music songs that use that phrase. But it means you either live at the back of a valley where the mountains come together, or the entrance of the valley where it starts. And he said, "I was born in 1926 in Wise, Virginia." And Wise is a combination of mobile homes that are stuck on the hillside, gas station here or there, a Dollar General and a church. And these mobile homes have a porch on them that have 10 dogs sleeping underneath that when somebody pulls up, they all run out and bark, and there's an F-150 in the driveway, and just a hint of a smell of kind of garbage burning. It's just kind of what I remember when I was there. So that's where he came from, except in 1926. I can't imagine what that was like. But he said he was a student, a good student, and he said learning was fun for him. And so he said he got to go to the integrated high school when he was 13. And he was the smartest kid in the school, kind of like this Black Sheldon, as I sort of visualized this. And he said that I stayed there till I was 16, and then I went to a college not far away, and I stayed there 1 year, and then I joined the Air Corps and was shipped off to South Korea during the Korean conflict, and I became the writer for Stars and Stripes. And he said it wasn't long until I was the editor, and he said shortly after that, he said I became the bureau chief for Associated Press for that whole part of the world. Now, in the early 50s, when you think about this young black man being the editor or the bureau chief of Associated Press, that was impressive to me. And so he shared this, and then I said, well, how did you happen to meet Dr. King? And he said, well, when I came back to the United States, he said, I got a job with the New York Times as a reporter. And he said, my area was anything to do with civil rights or people of color, that whole movement. And he said, I'd been in South Korea, so he said, I wasn't really that much informed about the movement. I said, or he said, it was, I knew about, these figures, Malcolm X and Rosa Parks and just Father Divine and Thurgood Marshall. But he said, I didn't really know that it was this national movement now. And he said, so when they asked me to somehow cover this King rally there in Manhattan, he said, I didn't really know much about what I was getting into. In fact, he said, I thought, satirically he says this, he said, I thought I was really the celebrity because I was this black kid that was a reporter for the New York Times. And he said, I showed up with this attitude of being totally professional. And he said, after I listened to Dr. King, he said, that man took me on a journey to a place I had never been, and he did it with words and the way that he said words. He could create chills over me just speaking these words. And he said, I went backstage, and he said, I was like this teenage girl at a Beatles concert when I was trying to interview Dr. King. And after a bit, he said, Dr. King looked at me and he said, I need you. I need you to be an editor, a writer, a researcher for me, to help me with my punctuation and my spelling. He said, I was flattered, but I didn't join him then. It was about another year before I actually joined the team of the King movement. And then I interrupted him. I said, tell me about Dr. King's theology. He said, so you want to know about Mike's theology? I'd never heard Dr. King called Mike. Well, it seems that growing up he was called Mike. And as an adult, there was maybe 10 people that called him Mike, and Junius Griffin was one of those people. He said, so you want to know about Mike's theology? And I said, yes, I would. And so he begins to share several things. And I had read, of course, some of his books, listened to all of his speeches. And I all of a sudden stopped him and I said, let's go to lunch. When we got to lunch, we chit-chatted about Italian food for just a few moments. And then I said, let me ask you, how did he become the breakout leader among civil rights leaders? Because I said there were all of these other ones, but somehow he emerged as the one. And in his professor voice, kind of sounded like Morgan Freeman. He said, you ask it. He said, it was his theology. He said, he literally believed the teachings and the words of Jesus. They were the source of his theology. He believed that through these words, he could make America accountable to the Constitution, that they could cash this check on the Bank of Justice. He literally believed that by using the teachings of Jesus, he could do this. As a result, he didn't have any fear. That there was nothing about him that was afraid of jail or afraid of death. His actions and his words were found in the teaching of Jesus. And I said, well, what do you mean? I mean, doesn't everybody say that? And he said, well, probably everybody says that. He said, but very few people literally believe that. He said Dr. King believed that in his words, that we were made stronger, that when we turned the other cheek, it wasn't that we were weaker, it is that it obligated God to the outcome of what we were doing. So that gave him this no fear. If God was truly responsible when we used the tools of Jesus, then we didn't need to be afraid. He literally believed that when others say bad things about you, that you say good things about them. When they do all manner against you, then you do what you can for them. He said these are the tools that Jesus used, and these are the tools that God rewards. He believed that. And in reality, that we are diminished, that we are weakened when we become violent as a result of violence. That when our movement becomes an uprising, they have the power to put us down. But when we turn the other cheek, he said, he believed that we become the conscience of those people that hate us. He said that in those teachings, he actually lived them out. He taught the people to live them out because they were never capable of winning by violence, but they were capable of doing the teachings of Jesus, obligating God, you see, to the outcome. Well, honestly, that's a different size of Jesus than I know. I mean, I can only see the foot of that Jesus, maybe the ear of that Jesus. That's huge. I hate to say this, I have a small Jesus. I mean, I was in traffic the other day and got angry at somebody. Turning the other cheek, saying good things about people that say bad things about, literally doing that obligates God to the outcome. So when he talked about turning the other cheek, he was talking about you being the first one to bring the level of tension down. It doesn't mean you're at fault. Obviously, people of color didn't create slavery. They didn't create oppression. They didn't create injustice. But by returning kindness, by returning love, by saying good things, they became the conscience of the people that hated them. And in so doing, they obligated God to his teachings. God has committed himself not to your cause, but to the teachings of Jesus. This is Ken. This is Black History Month. And I just wanted to tell this story that Junius Griffin told me about Mike, Dr. Martin Luther King.